Hello, I'm Erik Wait, and this is lesson number 13 in our study of Bibliology, and we'll be looking at the issue of English Bible translations. The question we really want to address is, why are there so many English Bible translations? There are others who have done videos on comparing a number of different English translations and then giving their own recommendation as to what English translation they think you should read. That's not really the purpose of this lesson. This lesson is to explain why there are so many English translations, the challenges of creating a translation, whether you're translating into English or Spanish or Russian or Dutch or any other language, and some of the errors or mistakes that can come up. But ultimately, within the standard English translations that are available, I'm talking King James, New King James, New American Standard, NIV, and so forth, ESV, RSV, there isn't a huge difference between them, not significant in terms of actual content. Mark Ward, who I have referred to in a previous video, has done an excellent job on this topic. His entire channel is devoted to the issue of translation, and he spends a lot of time dealing with the King James only folk. But that's not the purpose here. I'm going to do much more of a deep dive into the issues of translating from one language to another and looking at the two different families of Greek manuscripts and translation, the Textus Receptus or majority text and the critical text, and then look at just a few examples of difficulty in translation. And for those who believe that the King James only is a perfect translation, I'll demonstrate that it's not. There are times in which it has a strength over other translations, and there are times in which other translations have a strength. But this requires, to really fully grasp this requires an understanding of the nature of language theory, not just how to cut and paste from a lexicon the meaning of Greek and Hebrew words and then put them into a translation. So, first of all, there are a number of really bad distorted translations. Now, any text, whether it's the Bible or anything else, if you have a particular agenda, you can twist it to your own destruction. You can distort it in order to get your particular agenda across. One example is the New World Translation of the Holy Scripture. This is what the Jehovah's Witnesses, who are Arians who deny the deity of Christ, that put out there. Now, originally they used the King James Bible because it didn't have a copyright, but when they found it didn't support their doctrine, they came up with the New World Translation. Now, there's no record, at least not publicly, as to who actually wrote this thing. And this, out of humility, they don't want to sign their name to it. Well, any first or second year Greek student will be able to pick out the errors in this translation, particularly passages such as John 1:1, and they have put out documents, rather distorted quotations from Greek scholars to try to support themselves. But those Greek scholars have said no, they're taking things out of context and distorting things. So don't recommend a New World Translation. The funny thing is, and this is one I've had for years, and I've written all kinds of notes in the open part of it. You can actually use, because they're not consistent, they haven't thoroughly distorted it. You can use a New World Translation to prove the deity of Christ. But I'll save that for a whole nother lesson. Now, there was a time in which the church, when we call it the Roman Catholic Church now, it wasn't called the Roman Catholic Church back then. The argument is, look, if anybody can translate the Bible, then you could end up with things such as the New World Translation. So we want to control what are legal translations. And consequently, there was a huge persecution in the history of the church of anybody who was translating the Bible into the vernacular, into English, without the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. They would then take a person, turn them over to the state, and the state would punish them, even put them to death. They would burn translations and so forth. The notion, though, that somehow any organization can outwit or out advance technology, which enables the proliferation of copying manuscripts, the Gutenberg printing press, of course, computers now, eventually they had to give up because they couldn't keep up. They couldn't compete with technology, which enabled people to print multiple copies and spread them. The Chinese government has even put out a Bible to support, I'm not kidding, that they released in China to support Chinese communist propaganda. So yes, anybody can take any text and put whatever the heck that they want into it. You could do it with Shakespeare. You could do it with Homer's Iliad. You could do it with just about anything. You could do it obviously with the Quran. You could do it with anything else. So the second thing I want to deal with is a misconception regarding translations. One of the things that's often said in public media, but people who don't really know any better, and they haven't really thought it through, they haven't researched it, is, well, how can you trust the Bible since there are so many translations? It's been translated so many times. Now, this is a misconception of how manuscripts are developed and how the Bible has come to us down through the ages. One of my undergraduate degrees is in criminology or administrative justice or criminal justice. And in one of the classes, there's a class on evidences, the instructor, wanting to make the point about first-hand witnesses versus hearsay or second, third-hand witnesses, is you always want to have first-hand witness to an incident or to a crime scene. And if you have more than one witness, you want to separate them and get independent accounts of what they saw and what happened so they don't collude either intentionally or accidentally. And this is actually a biblical requirement. At two or more witnesses, and they have to be independent account. Now, if you take a look at the course of Jesus's trials, there was collusion and there was contradiction, and so there were trumped up witnesses in a trumped up trial. But the point is, what the instructor did was he told one person in the class or to a particular statement, and then that person was to turn around in the class, tell the person behind them, who would tell the person behind them, and then by the time it would make its way through the class, what the original story was, by the time it got to the end, had changed quite a bit. Now, of course, if a student wanted to be a smart aleck, they could intentionally change it in order to make it something ridiculous. But the point is clear, is that how well do people remember and pass it on and on? But that's not how we got the Bible. Now, I already covered all that in previous lessons in dealing with family manuscripts. We didn't receive the Bible by translating from a translation to a translation to a translation so that you have translation drift. You don't want to do that. The way translations are done is you go back to the Hebrew and Greek. One of the mottos of the Protestant Reformation was ad fontes, which means to go back to the source. So you go back to the Hebrew and Greek. You don't want to make another English translation from an English translation. You always want to go back to the Hebrew and Greek. So let's get into this. The Textus Receptus and the majority text. Until the 1800s, the Textus Receptus, or the received text, was the foremost Greek text from which the English New Testament was derived. It is based on the works of Roman Catholic scholar Desiderius Erasmus. The majority text is a correction of the Textus Receptus, where it had a little or no support in the manuscript tradition. The King James Version and the New King James Version are based on the Textus Receptus. In 1881, two prominent scholars, Brooke Foss Westcott and Fenton J.A. Hort, printed their New Testament in Greek, later known as the Critical Text. As a result of Westcott and Hort's work, their Critical Text became the standard Greek text used for modern translations for English New Testament, other than the King James Version and the New King James Version. The Critical Text was the one chiefly used for the English Revised Version, the New International Version, the New American Standard Bible, the English Standard Version, and virtually every other modern English translation of the Bible. But are the differences between the majority text and critical text significant? Daniel B. Wallace writes, there are approximately 300,000 textual variants among the New Testament manuscripts. The majority text differs from the Textus Receptus in almost 2,000 places. So the agreement is better than 99%. But the majority text differs from the modern critical text in only about 6,500 places. In other words, the two texts agree almost 98% of the time. Not only that, but the vast majority of these differences are so minor that they neither show up in translation nor affect exegesis. Consequently, the majority text and the modern critical text are very much alike in both quality and quantity. And again, Mark Ward does an excellent video on this very subject. I highly recommend you check out his channel. In fact, on this very issue of the difference between quality and quantity text. So, since someone else has already covered this subject so well, and they have an entire channel, a YouTube channel, devoted to this subject, I'm not going to rehearse and cover everything he has already done so well. Why repeat what he's done so well? But I do want to add further information as to what he has covered. Go a little bit more of a deep dive into translation challenges. So why are there so many English Bible translations? While there are some King James only devotees that will insist that the creation of multiple English Bible translations is part of a New Age conspiracy to move mankind to worship an Antichrist, nothing could be further from the truth. If we take the time to understand the challenges of translating any text from within one language family to another language family, we will see that the various English translations are attempting to accurately convey in an intelligible manner the meaning of the Hebrew and Greek text to the average English reader. There are challenges in translating from one language to another, and translators often have to make a difficult choice as to how to best convey not just the words from one language to another, as if just picking a word from a lexicon will suffice, but to convey the meaning of the passage as well. Those challenges are increased when the translation is crossing language families. For example, the Semitic family of languages includes Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, and Akkadian. The Indo-European languages include Greek and Armenian and others. English is a West Germanic language within the Indo-European languages. The Romance languages include Spanish, Italian, Romanian, and French and are derived from the Latin Vulgar. Translating from Hebrew to Aramaic is closer than translating from Hebrew to English. And this is especially so when you're not just translating prose, just a historical narrative, but when you're translating something that has a bit of a poetic tone to it, such as the Proverbs, the Psalms. Andrea Bocelli, one of favorite singers of mine, sings in Italian. Every once in a while does something in English, and his English is a little rough. But some of what he has sung in Italian, he has also sung in Spanish. So you can get a Spanish version of the same songs. And it works really, really, really well. However, if you take those Italian songs and you put them into English, it doesn't work really well. If you ever listen to someone do Italian arias in English, it loses something, not just in terms of maybe a strict meaning, but in terms of the beauty. The words don't quite fit the tune. So, and that's just a poetic language. But you have to realize it's not just a matter of you can take a dictionary and then take Hebrew Greek text and go, okay, what does this mean? Look it up, and then cut and paste in your translation. Now, when you first start learning Hebrew and Greek, that's kind of what you do. That's kind of what you do because you're being very wooden. But the reality is, we don't learn languages by writing. We learn a language by hearing our parents when we are little children, and we learn how to respond to our parents. And then we're, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years old, depending on how old you are, we learn our alphabet and we learn how to write. But as we develop our writing skills, we get better and better at it. So we communicate better and better so that what we write is not so wooden, not so tight. It's not Johnny went to the store. Johnny bought a loaf of bread. Johnny paid $5 for the loaf of bread. Johnny brought the loaf of bread home. You know what I mean? That kind of the way little kids would write. So, so your English teacher is going to tell you, hey, you need to write like you need to use pronouns. You need to use synonyms. You need to use that, and you learn how to be a more entertaining or more skillful writer. And of course, writing for a textbook, say a scientific textbook or an instruction manual, is very different than writing for a fictional story. Right? If you took the way you write for a technical manual and you wrote a fictional story like that, nobody would read it because it'd be too boring. And if you took the way you write for a fictional story and you put that as an instructional manual, you might go, hey, can you get to the point? Can you just tell me how to do this thing I need to do? It's a different way of writing. When you're writing legal documents, if you're an attorney, or you're writing a contract from one company to another, you have to be really, 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 really specific as to how you talk. And they get a little bit pedantic. Yeah, I get the point. Can you get? Well, the reason why you have to write the way you do in a legal contract is because it'll end up going to court and someone will challenge what was written in the contract because you left something out, and so it was ambiguous. And when something is ambiguous, it always goes back to the fault is on whoever wrote the contract. So you have to use a lot of legalese, a lot of legal terminology. So when you sign a contract, sometimes it's like, man, you need to be a lawyer in order to read these things. And that's why lawyers will not just represent people in court, they will read through legal documents when you sign a contract. So writing a poetry or writing a song. Well, the Bible has all these various genres in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. And so how things are written have to be taken into account, and the styles. And then there are cultural issues. We're going to get more into this as to how you can, and customs as to how you write and how you communicate. And then you have to figure, okay, that's a Semitic way of talking. This is an Asian way of talking. This is a Germanic way of talking. This is a Romantic language, way of talking, and how you're going to convey the ideas and precepts and concepts over into another language family. Alrighty, let's move on. The first Bible translation, the Septuagint. The Septuagint, abbreviated as LXX, is the first translation of the Bible from one language to another. It was frequently quoted by the authors of the New Testament. From it, we can learn, 1, how the translators translated from one language family to another, namely Hebrew and its worldview, into Greek. 2, that neither the Septuagint or New Testament should be read as if it were written by a Hellenist, in other words, from a Greek worldview, like Plato or Homer. 3rd, we can learn principles of translating the Bible into other languages. Dynamic or near equivalency in translating. If a word, term, or phrase cannot be translated letter for letter or word for word, a translator may provide a dynamic or near equivalency. An example of this can be seen in the genealogies of Jesus, in which he is referred to as the son of David. David, in biblical Hebrew, written with these Hebrew letters, the second letter makes a V sound. Second is, we're going from right to left, not left to right. So the letter that's in the middle makes a V sound. But Koine Greek, that's the Greek of the New Testament, has no letter with a V sound. So its nearest equivalency is the upsilon, which looks like a U in English. And thus, the critical text translates David with a delta, alpha, upsilon, iota, delta. The majority text, from which we get the King James, has delta, alpha, beta, iota, delta, because the second letter in Hebrew, that is bait, can make either a V or a B sound if it has a dagesh, that is a little dot in the middle of the letter, which is equivalent to beta in the second letter in Greek. So if you were to transliterate the Hebrew into English, it would look like DWD. But the Greek translated into English is either Daoud, D-A-U-I-D, which is what we'd find in the critical text, or David, which we would find in the majority text. So there's two letters in the Hebrew language that can give you the V sound. As I said, the second letter in the Hebrew alphabet, bait, if you put a little dot in the middle of it, gives you this hard B sound. If it doesn't have the little dot, called the dagesh, then it's a V sound. V. Or if it has a vav, that can also give you the V sound. This is a textual variant between the critical text and the majority text. Now, what's the result? Both of them, if you read it, you're going to get the same name, David. There's a similar to that in my name. My name could be spelled is spelled E-R-I-K. Now, in the neighborhood that I grew up in, there were 4 Eriks. We were all had blonde hair. Yes, I had hair back in the day. We all had blonde hair, either maybe blue or hazel. So our eyes were very similar. We're, same complexion, and all born between 1966 and 1969. So there were 4 Eriks in my neighborhood, but I was the only one who spelled it with a K. Now, there are some other spellings of Erik, E-R-I-C-H. I had an Erik in one of my classrooms. He spelled it E-R-I-C-K. So there's a lot of variances in how you spell the name Erik. It is not uncommon for me to get emails where my first name is misspelled. And I'm particular about my name spelling because I grew up in a neighborhood where everybody else was a E-R-I-C. And I'm different. I'm the E-R-I-K. I'm the E-R-I-K guy. So I'm very particular. I want my name spelled with a K. Well, there's a couple different ways. You could spell David in Greek. And so in hearing it, those who were writing these manuscripts, one spelled it one way and one spelled it another way. So not only in terms of translating the Hebrew into Greek for one particular word, but as we're going to see here, sometimes you have to make a decision. Are we going to go letter for word, not only letter for letter, but word for word in translating this, which may not make any sense to the English reader? But you're going to say, well, it's on them to try to figure out what this means. They're going to have to do some research. Or you're going to go, this is what this phrase means. And so rather than translating word for word, we're going to translate the meaning of the phrase. And that's a decision that has to be made. So there's a degree to woodenness in translation and going from word for word over into a dynamic equivalency. And sometimes the problem is when you start heading into dynamic equivalency, you may not be providing a dynamic equivalence. You may be providing an interpretation. And we're going to see here, sometimes the King James only does that. It's not a translation. It's a interpretation. And sometimes it puts words in there that aren't justified. Now, I'm sort of getting ahead of myself in this lesson, but there are times in which it's not just a matter of translating letter for letter or word for word, but words can be supplied from the context, Because you could have a word in Greek, one word in Greek, that to really convey what it means requires 5 words from English, 5 words in English. So you go, so this whole sentence here, where did that come from? That came from one Greek word. The reason why is, again, we could get off into this, is because Greek, like many other languages, is a case language. You have the root of the word, and then you have a prefix and a suffix. And these determine whether it's first, second, third, whether it's singular or plural, or whether this is masculine or feminine, whether this is an event that happened in the past and was completed, whether this is something that's currently ongoing, and so on and so forth. And you go study Greek, then you know what I'm talking about. English doesn't work like that. So sometimes an entire sentence is provided by the context or by fully expounding the meaning of that particular Greek word. Now, this isn't something special about Greek. This is true of all case languages. So the other thing is, sometimes if you were to translate something from Greek into English, just word for word, it would sound the way maybe someone who's just learning English talks. You ever talk to someone, you sound like Tarzan. You would sound like Tarzan. Me Tarzan, you Jane. We swing on vine and jungle. You know. Sorry, I'm just trying to think like Tarzan. We eat banana. We take monkey and climb the tree. You know, you would sound like that. Me Tarzan, you Jane. That's how it would come across. It would sound like that. You're like, and you don't want something to sound like that. So, from the context, you provide words, but it's justified by the context. Again, in order to explain that fully, we would have to go then do entire lessons on and studying Greek. But sometimes words are provided by the context. Translating in historical context. In addition to translating across language families, the translator has to keep in mind the historical context as the meaning of words changes over time. Communication can also involve cultural metaphors, idioms, and figures of speech that may not exist in another language. So the translator has to decide whether they provide a word-for-word translation and leave it up to the reader to figure out the meaning, or whether they convey the meaning of the text. For example, in English, to say the old man kicked the bucket can mean that the old man died. But if the old man was in the barn milking a cow, it could be an explanation as to how he spilled the milk. If the figurative phrase, kick the bucket, is unique to English, and the event was being translated into another language in which kick the bucket doesn't refer to dying, then the translator has to decide whether to translate it word for word and expect the reader to figure out what it means, or translate the meaning of the phrase as the old man died. So translate word for word or meaning of the text. An example of the translator having to decide whether to translate word for word or convey what they think is the meaning of the phrase is found in Philippians 2:7, and how various English Bible translations convey the phrase hauton ekenosin. In the King James Version we read, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. In the NIV, or New International Version, it states, rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in the human likeness. In the New American Standard, which translates it word for word, it says, but emptied himself by taking the form of a bondservant and being born in the likeness of men. In these English Bibles, only the New American Standard is actually translating hauton ekenosin word for word into English. And that is actually how I believe it should be translated if you understand the larger context of the passage, which we will get into. So the King James Version and the NIV and others are not providing a translation, but an interpretation, and there's a reason why for it, which I'll get into in just a second. I believe the King James Version and the NIV are misinterpreting the passage due to a failure to recognize the imagery of the Old Testament libation offering that we read about in Exodus 29:40-41, Leviticus 7:12-15, and Numbers 15:7, being employed to describe the incarnation and death of Jesus Christ. If you look at the larger context, Paul continues to use this libation language in Philippians 2:17 and Philippians 4:18. But the translators of the King James Version are doing so in order to avoid implying a heretical doctrine which asserts that Jesus gave up his divinity in the incarnation, a doctrine that was taught by Gnostics and sometimes repeated today by charismatics and Pentecostals.
Even though Jesus was fully God, he completely laid down his divinity when he was on this earth. Completely. So that he could be fully human.
So the reason why the King James Version and the NIV do not translate as he emptied himself is because it's a Gnostic heresy. It's not just a heresy. There are heresies and then there are damnable heresies. A damnable heresy is one that distorts the person and work of Jesus Christ. This is an extremely dangerous and heretical doctrine taught by early Gnostics, but also taught by some Pentecostal circles as well, as you just saw there. So we're going to cover this more in a course on Christology and on the doctrine of God. So we'll get more into this later. But my point here is, if you were to look at the context of the text, not only in terms of literary language that's being used, allusions to the Old Testament libation offering, but also to look at the structure of the text. So in the image that Paul is giving us is Jesus humbled himself. Now he starts off, he's saying to the church, to have this likeness of mind, have this way of thinking as Christ thought, who humbled himself in his incarnation and poured himself out as a libation offering, taking on, although being very God, taking on humanity and pouring himself out to death on the cross. And then Paul says in Philippians 2:17, and is that he himself is doing what he's telling the church at Philippi to do, but even if I am being poured out as a drink offering. And then he's going to quote Exodus 29:40-41 in Philippians 4:18, when he talks about the Philippians giving to the church and providing support. And he says, this offering you're giving is like a sweet, soothing aroma. So again, refers to the drink offering. Again, I could go much more into this, but we could spend a whole other hour on just this particular text. So the structure of the text, it's something called a chiasm. The structure of the text, again, we'll do that in hermeneutics, called a chiasm. The language of the text, you borrowing from drink offering language from the Hebrew Bible, not only in terms of Christ pouring himself out to the point of death on the cross, Paul being poured out, and then the end of Philippians referring to the pouring out of generosity from the Philippian church, that he's saying, hey, this is like the drink offering in the Old Testament. So the pouring out, or the hauton ekenosin, the emptying himself, is not just the incarnation, it's the entire sacrifice to death on the cross. Now, if the translators in the English Testament, of the English New Testament, if they realized that that's what they were doing, then they would go, oh yeah. Or if the Gnostics or the Pentecostal wackos asserting this heretical doctrine of Jesus Christ giving up his divinity could see and understand the language of the text, then they wouldn't, the translators wouldn't need to put in, he made himself no reputation, because that's not what it means. They realize this in reference to this sacrifice. And the Gnostics will realize this has nothing to do with Jesus giving up his divinity or some sort of nonsense like that. So I understand why some of these English translations have translated hauton ekenosin in this fashion, but I believe it's in error. Cultural context, the repetition of negatives. One example of a cultural difference between Hebrew and English is the way in which there is an importance of words in a message being conveyed. In Hebrew, the repetition of a word within a historical narrative can be a way to emphasize a thought, whereas in English, repetition in prose can be considered to be redundant. Where Hebrew and Greek might repeat a word for emphasis, English will instead use an exclamation mark in its punctuation. Now, English will repeat words in poetry, but in prose, I remember as a child being told, use a synonym, don't keep using the same word over and over and over again. Well, how do we emphasize things in English? By punctuation, we put an exclamation mark, or sometimes we italicize or put things in brackets. We have other ways in order to make an emphasis. But both Hebrew and Greek, because they don't use that punctuation or italicization, the way they emphasize things and the importance of the text is by repetition. But if you were to translate it like that into English, it can be like, it's hard to listen. It's difficult to listen to. It sounds too repetitive. Now, so thinking pastorally, in terms of English translations, and when you're preaching or teaching in a church, what I would do, I've preached through, for example, Ruth chapter 4, which has a lot of repetition in it. Whatever English translation they had, along with like the church bulletin, maybe has the list of the order of worship and so forth, or announcements, that kind of thing. I would provide my translation, which would help them follow along, and I would explain in the context of a sermon that this is the emphasis of the text, what's going on here, and here's what is actually in the Hebrew text, and how this is emphasized in the Hebrew text, even if it doesn't necessarily show up in your English text. But we'll get into that. So, one way in which emphasis can be made is by using double negatives, both in Hebrew and Greek. For example, so in Romans 6:1, the Greek employs a double negative, me genoita. My pronunciation of Greek isn't all that great. They teach you in seminary, how they want you to pronounce things, but then you talk to someone who speaks modern Greek, and that's not how they pronounce it. So they're really not teaching you how to pronounce Greek properly when you go to seminary. But the point is, we're not going to speak Greek. You're not learning to speak Greek. You're learning to translate it from English and how to read Greek to English, not how to go around and talk to each other in Greek. Anyway, so the Greek employs a double negative here in Romans chapter 6 for emphasis. In American English, we're often told that using double negatives is bad grammar, as a double negative results in a positive. I ain't never done that. Right? Look, kids say that. I ain't, there's a negative, never done that. So you have a double negative. And so in English thinking, when you have a double negative, the second negative reverses the first negative. So you're actually saying a positive. And now I hear people saying in English, no, double negatives are just fine, which is fine because language, the meaning of terms and how we speak is determined by usage, not necessarily strictly by how a dictionary is. So languages morph and change. So, but traditionally, we don't use, not supposed to use double negatives in English, but in Greek and Hebrew, they use negatives for emphasis. So let's look at two translations, one being the King James Version and the New American Standard. King James Version says, "What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein?" And the New American Standard says, "What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may increase? Far from it. How shall we who died to sin still live in it? May it never happen." So even though the Greek word theos is not in the verse, the King James Version has added the word God to the text, presumably because saying God forbid was at the time a common cultural means of emphasizing a negative. The New American Standard Bible is probably closer to a proper translation, but I think it might be better to simply state absolutely not. So in Romans chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, the King James Version, which is not a perfect translation, has added the word God. Now, I don't get upset about that. It's not some sort of conspiracy. It's not blaspheming. It's not you taking, the word God in vain. Just at the time, that was a way of saying, no way, not happening. All right, don't do that. That's a way of saying that at the time, but we don't say that today. Instead, the New American Standard says, "May it never happen," and you put an exclamation mark. But even that's really long. May it never happen. I think it would better to say absolutely not. Right? Keeps it short. Reflects two words. Absolutely not reflects two Greek words. So I think this shorter translation that I think it should be absolutely not with an exclamation mark is a better translation than both the New American Standard and the King James Version. But the important point here of this in this lesson is to realize that it's a cultural difference of communicating. In English, we don't employ double negatives, or at least didn't when I was a kid. But in Hebrew and Greek, they employed them for emphasis. Cultural context and the repetition of words. Another way Hebrew and Greek uses repetition is to emphasize a theme in the passage. However, in American English, teachers tend to teach young children to use synonyms rather than repeatedly using the same word over and over. An example of the difference between Hebrew and English can be seen in the way in which Ruth chapter 4 can be translated. A key word in the text in Hebrew is the word goel, which means redeemer, but in the cultural context, it means kinsman redeemer. In the Hebrew Bible, redeem or goel, both in a verb and noun form, show up 15 times. In the King James Version, redeem only appears 9 times. In the New American Standard Bible, redeem or goel shows up 10 times. In the New International Version, redeem only appears 9 times, and it makes a distinction between Boaz and the competing goel by translating it as kinsman redeemer, which is actually more accurate than the King James Version and the New American Standard. Now, there are some King James only conspiracy theorists that they don't think about language theory, they don't think about how language works. They're just being bean counters and how many times a word such as Jesus shows up. And if it doesn't show up the same amount of times as it does in the King James Version, that's a conspiracy to deny something about Jesus Christ. And it's absolute nonsense. Now imagine if I was a conspiracy theorist and I would say, they're trying to reduce the role of the Goel, the Redeemer, and Christ is our Redeemer. And so by not having redeem in there in verb and noun form 15 times like the Hebrew, this is a conspiracy, right? And you'd go, wow, this bald bearded dude is nuts, right? Well, that's exact same thing that these King James only people are doing. They're not really thinking about the language, all right? Uh, if there is a grand conspiracy to teach false doctrine concerning Christ, if the New American Standard and NIV and these other translations are, the devil's Bibles, the devil has done a really bad job. If that was the aim. So the King James Version, the New American Standard, and the NIV, as well as others, are not conspiring to cover up the importance of the Redeemer, a prefigure of Christ, as we read in Ephesians 1:7, Titus 2:14, 1 Corinthians 1:30, Revelation 5:9-10. Rather, they are translating it in such a way as the Redeemer is maintained without woodenly translating the text so that it would be awkward to read in English. So the translator has to decide whether they provide a word-for-word translation and leave it up to the reader to figure out the meaning or whether they convey the meaning. But I think this is why, if you're going to be in the ministry, you should have at least a working knowledge of Hebrew and Greek. And most seminaries these days aren't providing that. And when I say working knowledge, I mean, it's not that you're a Greek scholar or Hebrew scholar, but that you can, with various language tools, do the work yourself. And then when you preach, or teach, and you have to do this judiciously, you don't want to overwhelm the congregation, provide information that you gain in your study. Now, the reality is the one who learns the most and gains the most is the one who prepares the lesson, right? Or the sermon or the homily. When you prepare a sermon, and if you really are diligent in what you do, you get this much information. But you're not going to preach for 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 6, 8 hours. You have to whittle it down as to what the congregation can actually endure to listen. Maybe you preach 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, however long it is. So you have to pick and choose what you're going to convey. So what happens is if you try to convey everything, pretty soon people would tune out. They don't have, particularly these days, they don't have the retention level. And so you have to give them like little bite-sized pieces. You can't give them the entire buffet. You have to give them little bite-sized pieces. But one of the things you can do, and I've done, is provide additional notes. So, let's say we're doing a series. I'm currently preaching on this particular book of the Bible. We'll be covering this week this particular chapter. For your personal reading, for your devotion during the week, here is additional information. You could even put those on a church website so that, yeah, you're only preaching half an hour, give or take, whatever it is. But during the week, during their devotions or whatever else, they can read this other stuff. So when they come to church, they're actually better prepared and will be able to follow along. Or you could do a midweek Bible study in which we're going through a particular book of the Bible. The sermon's going to be on this particular text, but in the middle of the week, we'll do a more in-depth study during a Bible study. That would be my recommendation. But you have to address this sort of pastorally. So, as I said before, I once preached through the entire book of Ruth, and I would provide little notes, little handouts that go along in the church handout at the beginning of the service, so they would get this point. And I would make little reference to it, but I wouldn't go in depth as to all these translation issues. Translators have to decide not just what lexical word they need to use, but how to convey the thought behind the language so that it makes sense to the average English reader. To translate every sentence in a word-for-word manner could make the text unintelligible. For example, in John we read, Jesus te amoi kai soi gunai. If we were to translate this word for word, it would be, what to you and you, me, woman, which in English does not make any sense. All English translations of John 2:4 are fairly similar. The King James Version says, Jesus said to her, woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. The NIV says, woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, my hour has not yet come. The New American Standard says, and Jesus said to her, woman, what does this have to do with us? My hour has not yet come. In order for the translation to make sense in English, all translations have, from the context of the passage, fleshed out the full meaning of ti amoi kai soi gunoi. The phrase also appears in Mark 5:7. So again, it's not a matter of just taking a simple cut and paste from a lexicon and providing it in English. It's by the context as to how this translates. And so if you haven't studied at least some basics how Greek and Hebrew work, and you're trying to use an interlinear or some online resources, while they're great tools, they're not a substitute for getting a basic understanding of Hebrew and Greek. And I think, at least to some extent, not just people learning, vocabulary words and the cases of the Hebrew and Greek, people need an understanding of language theory and how language works. In fact, I think probably in seminary, it would be best if they got a basic understanding of Greek words and grammar and structure, and then most of the emphasis should actually be emphasized on how language theory works. I think that's more important than be able to translate off the top of your head anywhere from Hebrew and Greek and becomes a pseudo Hebrew and Greek scholar. So your professors that know Hebrew and Greek, they're scholars, and because they have this passion for the languages, they want their students to become like that. But here's reality. Pastors have so much going on. Rarely do they spend a whole lot of time translating the text. And sadly, a lot of people who graduate from seminary in time start losing what they learned in seminary. They didn't stick. There are skills that if you don't keep using them, you lose them. And learning very difficult languages, Hebrew and Greek, particularly since it's not a spoken language, we don't go around talking in Hebrew and Greek. It's hard to maintain that. I mean, if you're going to learn, German or French or Italian, unless you're immersed in a culture in which you can regularly engage in engage in Italian or German or French or whatever foreign language you're trying to, it's hard to maintain it. You need to not just learn from a textbook or from a class, but you need to engage and interact in those languages so you can. So it's best if you're going to study Italian, hey, go spend a couple years in Italy and engage with Italians so that you get immersed and you're going to pick it up really fast. In fact, even if you don't take classes, if you have to go spend some time in Italy, you're going to start picking it up. I lived in San Diego and worked along the California Mexican border, and I just by immersion, you start picking up Spanish. So, because we're not immersed in Hebrew, we're not immersed in Greek when you go to seminary in terms of speaking it, to maintain that years later becomes very, very, very difficult. And I can go to people I graduated seminary with, and I can give them a Hebrew and Greek Bible, and all they passed their ordination exams a couple decades ago, how many of them have really maintained their use of the language? So I think it's better to learn language theory and how to use these Hebrew and Greek tools than necessarily to attempt to become a sort of pseudo Hebrew and Greek scholar. Now, if you want to be a Hebrew and Greek scholar, go for it. All for it. All the more to you. I support that endeavor, and the church could use more Hebrew and Greek scholars, not just cloistered away in some seminary somewhere, but actually in the church, actually embedded into the church and serving and using their gifts and skills in the church, rather than being put away on a hill as some cloistered away ivory tower theologian. Other considerations in translation: literary form and the use of the text, particularly in translating the poetic texts such as Proverbs and Psalms, which use various types of parallelisms, such as synonymous parallelism, antithetical parallelisms, and synthetic parallelisms. Oftentimes, they're combined in a literary form known as a chiasm, a literary device in which a sequence of ideas is presented and then repeated in reverse order. These literary forms exist in texts such as Jonah chapter 2, in the Gospels, in the Epistles, and the book of Revelation. The result is the meaning is conveyed not just in the individual words or even in the sentence, but in the structure and the larger literary context of the entire passage. So what's a chiasm? The English letter X is chi. A chiasm is one in which there is a structure to the text where we have a first statement, a second statement, maybe a third statement, and then that thought is repeated, and then it's thought and it's repeated and repeated. So you have A statement, B statement, C statement, and then C statement is repeated, and B statement and A statement. We actually have one of those in Philippians chapter 2, which I referred to earlier. And so the meaning of the text is not just by translating the individual words, but considering the structure of the text. Now, once you learn about chiasms, you can start seeing them everywhere, but it is a legitimate literary form to help convey a message. So other issues that have to be considered are, is the text going to be merely read, or is it going to be sung in corporate worship? Translating a psalm for a Bible that is meant to be read may be different than translating a psalm for a psalter, which may be put to music. So I have kind of a large collection of psalters. Sadly, singing the psalms has been greatly diminished in the church. Instead, what often is conveyed in the church are something closer to a jingle used for commercials, hyper simplistic, barely recognizable as something Christian, and the Psalms are completely avoided, or there's only just a teeny weeny bit of a psalm that's repeated over and 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 over again. So I highly recommend that churches not just use hymns, and if you want to use praise music, but get psalms into the Bible. What better way can there be to learn the Bible, the Psalms, by singing them? So this is a psalter. All 150 psalms are in the psalter, and there are a number of different ways in which the psalms have been put to music. Sometimes they will use a well-known hymn tune and then translate the Hebrew in such a way that it'll fit the tune, or sometimes they'll write a new tune for that particular psalm. Now, the most well-known psalm, obviously, is Psalm 23. There's several different versions of Psalm 23 in this. So this is a translation of the Psalms from Hebrew into English, as much as the King James Version, the New American Standard, and the NIV. The difference is it's translated in such a way that it will fit a tune. And if you know anything about music, then you have to make a choice of words. So the meaning is the same. The meaning is not lost. The meaning is not lost. This is used among other denominations by the RPCNA, Reformed Presbyterian Church North America, a very conservative, Bible-believing church that only sings psalms, and they sing them a cappella. But there are other churches that use these and others as well. So that's another thing to be considered, is how it's going to be used. So what translations do I use and recommend? So I'm sitting here at my desk, and I've got a computer sitting in front of me. I have the camera and the mic here. To the left and to the right on my desk, I have 1, 2, 3, 4. I have 4 Bibles over here, and I have 15 Bibles over here, and then I have my daily reader Bible sitting over here. Behind me, I have Greek Bibles, I have Hebrew Bibles, I have the Septuagint, and of course, obviously online, there's a host of Bibles over there. So what do I personally regularly use for reading and for studying? That's another thing. What's the purpose of the translation? Again, just as you might translate it in such a way so that it can be sung in a psalter, there's a difference between devotional reading and studying. My pattern of the day is I get up in the morning, drink some water, and I make my coffee. In fact, I'm recording this early in the morning and drinking coffee. My daily habit is I have my coffee and I read passages from the Bible. I might make a few notes. Maybe I'll have a thought of something. Hey, I want to look more into this later. So I'll have a spreadsheet on the computer, I'll make a few notes, but I'm really not studying at that point because I need to leave. So I come in, I spend a half an hour to an hour praying, reading, drinking coffee, wake up with the Word of God, and then I go take a shower, get dressed, and head out and go to work. That's how I start my day. So the point at that is not to get an in-depth study. Now, later on in the day, or maybe on the weekends, or in the afternoon, or in the evenings, whatever else, I'm going to do more in-depth study. I'm going to probably use a New American Standard. Sorry, I'm going to reach in here, get real close to the camera. This is a New American Standard, and you can see it's kind of well worn. Now, this is the Inductive Study Bible. People might talk about this so much. It's not so much as that the inductive observation style that I necessarily use. The reason why I use this one is, one, my eyes ain't what they used to be. This has super large print, really large print, which I like. It has really wide margins. I have study Bibles. I have the Reformation Study Bible, the New Geneva Study Bible. I have an old Schofield Bible that I inherited from my grandfather. I don't recommend Schofield. And I don't recommend study Bibles. Rather, I recommend getting a Bible with real wide margins, really wide margins. Get a nice fine ink pen, do your own study, and make your own notes on the side. Make your notes on the side. And if you were to go through this, you would find places where I've made my notes. So this is the New American Standard. It's a little bit more. It's a little bit more leaning on the word for word. It leans more on the word for word translation. The NIV is a smoother reading. It's a little bit more thought for thought, as best as that can be conveyed, which is why I'm reading it just in the morning with my coffee, because it's not my intent to go do a deep dive necessarily. I do make little notes in terms of big picture notes on things, but I'm not doing a deep dive study. The next thing I do is oftentimes, and even compare those two translations, and you could use a New King James and you use the King James if you're accustomed to the King James, do the same thing, is then I compare oftentimes with other translations. Now you can do this online. There are websites that do this online, but I also have, this is a comparative Bible. So it's a side-by-side Bible. So this has King James, Amplified, New American Standard, and NIV. So you can actually do a side-by-side comparison of the translations. And where there is some sort of difference, as we saw there, say in Philippians, it's an opportunity to go, why is this different? And then do a deep dive and to find out why. And you can do a deep dive find why as to why in really good commentaries. A lot of times commentaries will address these issues, but some Bibles also will footnote, or it could be translated this way, depending on the context. So my recommendations are, but I also have an RSV, an ESV. This is Aramaic New Covenant, a literal translation, as if you're translating from Aramaic. There are people, and I won't get into that in this, there are people who believe that the New Testament was originally written in Aramaic and then later translated into Greek. I don't agree with that, but that's a whole nother day. There is also an attempt, as I talked about, literary form and structuring it on the text. This is by Everett Fox. This is the first 5 books of Moses, obviously the Pentateuch. And they don't just translate it, but they laid out on the text in terms of what they believe is the literary form so that you see the parallels in the text. And so it's taking into consideration the structure of the language of the text and how they lay it out on the paper. Now, you can see this is just the Pentateuch. Look how thick that is. Now, if you were to do this with the entire Bible, right, your Bible would be this thick, right? You'd be carrying around this huge Bible, because by illustrating the literary form, you have to space things out on the page in order to show the parallels, which then means you use up a lot more paper, unless you're going to do super teeny weeny print, which isn't going to do you any good. So the result is, this is just the Pentateuch, and if you were to have the entire Bible like this, it would be a huge library just to have the Bible. Now, there is more available than just the Pentateuch on that. But I think, at least in terms of the concept of understanding literary structure, how it conveys meaning, not just the meaning of the individual words, and not just the denotative meaning, but the connotative meaning of words in translation, I think this is at least the concept, at least get the concept across. I also have, because I live in California, I have Santa Biblia. I have a Spanish Bible. And if you have other languages in your neighborhood, you may be interacting with people in your neighborhood that speak a different language. If you can read it, and you want to start picking up some of the language in order to engage with people, you can get other Bible translations as well. Quick references. I'm still a little old school. I'll still grab my hard copy lexicons. If I'm in a hurry, I might look and use something online. I do like to compare a lot of times when I see something in Greek. In the New Testament, I often ask myself, does this Greek word appear in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament? Because That will help you understand not necessarily the meaning of the text in Greek per se, but how they understood that Greek word from a more Hebrew mindset, right? So if the translators of the Septuagint are Hebraic in their thinking, then what Greek words are they trying to use to translate over into Greek? And consequently, if the writers of the New Testament are Hebraic in their thinking, they're not Greeks. They're not Greek philosophers. You can't read the Greek in the New Testament the way you would read Homer's Iliad or Plato or anything like that. And that's a huge mistake by doing that. We'll get into more of that when we talk about hermeneutics. But you can, and sometimes I hear people make assertions about something in Greek, and I'm like, "This is the meaning of this Greek word." Da, 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 da. And I'm like, No. If in the Septuagint, that same Greek word is used this way. So you can't make this point because it's much more than that or less than that. For example, the word agape, I've heard, and I think it started with C.S. Lewis in the early 1970s, and then people like C.S. Lewis, and so then they start repeating things he said about the word love, the four loves, and they start making these assertions about how agape is this big, huge, different meaning, a Christian word of agape, da, 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 as a contrast to phileo or eros, and da 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 da. And so it was very common still today. Oh, agape, da 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 da. Well, guess what word is used in the Song of Solomon, which is a very romantic book, let's say, to convey this romantic love between a husband and wife? It's agape. It's agape. Again, I'm getting off on a tangent, but the point I'm trying to make is the Septuagint can be handy to understand sometimes the meaning of Greek words. All right. So that's it for this particular lesson and for this entire series. If you're watching this lesson but you didn't watch the previous lessons, I highly recommend you go back to lesson 1 and watch the entire series. Uh, I may, if some other topic comes up that I think needs to be addressed in the topic of bibliology, I may add to the series. But as for now, this is the end of this lesson. My next series that I want to be doing will be on hermeneutics. We've touched on some issues relating to hermeneutics in this lesson. We've also touched on the issue of worldviews. We've touched on apologetics. We've touched on Christology. We've sort of introduced a number of different topics during the series, and we'll get more into that in other classes or other series or other lessons. Until next time, may the Lord richly bless you.